Chapter 1. Introduction. The City of Cities. Jerusalem, the sound of this name alone has triggered deep feelings for thousands of years. No other city in the world carries as many hopes, longings, and conflicts as this one. For Jews, it is the holy city where the temple stood, the heart of the people of Israel. For Christians, it is the place where Jesus preached, died, and rose again. For Muslims, it is the third holiest city in Islam, from where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven. Jerusalem is not just a geographical place, but a symbol that stands for faith, history, power, and identity. The history of this city is unique and yet exemplary for all of humanity. It tells of rise and fall, of destruction and reconstruction, of hope and disappointment. People have lived in this place for almost 5,000 years, building and tearing down walls, building temples and turning them into rubble. No other city has been besieged, destroyed, and refounded as often as Jerusalem. And no other city has so often become a projection screen for myths and longings. Geographically, Jerusalem is not on a river, not on a coast, not on a trade route. None of the conditions that usually explain the rise of a great city. And yet, it became the center of religions and empires. Perhaps this is precisely their secret. Jerusalem was never a place of mere trade or power, but always a spiritual symbol, a place that drew meaning from itself. The name itself carries the tension in itself. Jerusalem, in its oldest root, probably means city of peace or foundation of the god Shalom. And yet, the history of this city is marked by war and bloodshed. It was conquered, destroyed, or besieged more than 50 times. Again and again, the victors believed they could win it over, and again it remained more than just a city, a dream that could not be destroyed. For Jews, Jerusalem has been the center of the world since the time of King David. This is where God himself was to dwell, where the temple arose, where heaven and earth met. Even after the destruction of the temple, the city remained the invisible center of Jewish faith. To this day, Jews direct their prayers to Jerusalem, and the phrase, "next year in Jerusalem," became a symbol of hope in exile. For Christians, Jerusalem became the stage for the central drama of their religion. This is where Jesus entered, where he was crucified, where his disciples proclaimed the message of the resurrection. Soon after his death, Jerusalem became a place of pilgrimage, a holy city which was transfigured in the New Testament as the heavenly Jerusalem as an image of the kingdom of God. For Christianity, the city became the place of origin and the destination of countless pilgrims. Jerusalem is also of paramount importance for Muslims. As early as the 7th century, they built the Dome of the Rock, a structure that remains one of the most impressive examples of Islamic architecture to this day. Tradition says that Muhammad began his journey to heaven from here. With the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the city became the third sanctuary of Islam after Mecca and Medina. The tension between these three religions, all of which lay claim to Jerusalem, still shapes the city today. But these tensions are not only religious. They are also political, cultural, and historical. For Jerusalem was never only a city of faith, but also a place of power. Whoever controlled Jerusalem symbolically claimed a superior role, be it as king of Israel, Roman emperor, caliph, crusader, or sultan. The history of Jerusalem is therefore a story of domination and resistance, of rise and fall. It begins in the early centuries of the Bronze Age, when the first settlements were built on the hill. It leads through the conquest by David and the reign of Solomon, over the building and destruction of the temples, over the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. It tells of Byzantine emperors and Muslim caliphs, of crusaders and sultans, of Ottomans and British, of Zionists and Arabs, of division and the longing for unity. In each epoch, Jerusalem reflected more than just a balance of power of the moment. It has always been a mirror of the great currents of history, the conflict between East and West, between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, between tradition and modernity. To this day, Jerusalem is a focal point of world politics. The question of who owns the city, who governs it, who watches over its holy sites is unresolved and remains one of the central conflicts of the present day. But precisely because it is so controversial, it has never lost its unique appeal. Jerusalem is more than a city. It is an idea, a myth, a dream. It is the city of cities that became immortal in songs, prayers, and stories. Anyone who deals with their history embarks on a journey through the millennia, a journey that tells of kings and prophets, of wars and visions, of destruction and reconstruction. This script aims to retrace this journey. It wants to tell the story of Jerusalem from its beginnings to the present day. Chapter by chapter, epoch by epoch, we want to uncover the layers of this unique city. And the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. Jerusalem is not only history, but always also the present.
Chapter 2. The Beginnings, Early Times and First Settlements. The history of Jerusalem begins long before the great kings, temples, and battles that would later shape the city's image. It dates back to a time when small communities of farmers and shepherds settled the hills of the Judean highlands. What we know about this early epoch comes from archaeological finds, sparse inscriptions, and the later stories of the Bible. But even if the sources are incomplete, a picture can be drawn. Jerusalem was a special place early on, whose location and importance laid the foundation for its later greatness. Archaeological traces show that the area of today's Jerusalem was already inhabited in the Neolithic Age. Finds of ceramics, flint tools, and remains of simple settlements indicate that people lived here around 5,000 years ago. However, it was not until the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, that a permanent settlement developed from these approaches. The location was decisive. Situated on a hill, between valleys and springs, the place offered shelter and water, two decisive factors for survival. The Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley was particularly important. It was the lifeline of Jerusalem for thousands of years. Whoever controlled the spring could permanently secure a settlement on this dry highland. Later, the inhabitants built complex systems to protect the water and make it accessible even in times of siege. Even in this early phase, topography and technology combined to make the site a permanent center. The first known inhabitants of Jerusalem probably belonged to the Canaanite tribes. These people settled large parts of today's Israel, Palestine, and Syria. In Egyptian sources, the name Urusalim or Rushalimum first appears in the 2nd millennium BC. The name refers to an early deity called Shalom, who was associated with dusk and peace. Even then, the city had a religious dimension that gave it a special character. In the 19th and 18th centuries BC, Jerusalem developed into a fortified city. Archaeological excavations have brought to light the remains of massive walls, proving that there was not just a loose collection of huts here, but an organized community. The city was located on the edges of important trade routes that connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Although it was not a trading center like Damascus or Megiddo, its location made it a strategic post that major powers could not ignore. This is particularly evident in the so-called Amarna letters, a collection of Egyptian diplomatic letters from the 14th century BC. In it, a ruler named Abdi Heba appears, who is referred to as the king of Jerusalem. He was not an independent ruler, but a vassal of the pharaoh, dependent on his benevolence and military protection. In his letters, he desperately asks for support against rival tribes and neighboring princes who threaten his power. These documents show two things. First, that Jerusalem was already an urban center of political importance at that time. On the other hand, it was always in a field of tension between independence and foreign rule, a pattern that was to run through the entire history of the city. Religiously, Jerusalem already played a role in the Canaanite period. Archaeological finds point to sanctuaries and places of worship that may have been dedicated to the god Shalom or the deity El. Later, the Israelites took up these places with their own religious tradition. So the idea that Jerusalem is a holy place goes back to the earliest times. With the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, around the 12th century BC, the region changed fundamentally. Migration of peoples, the collapse of old empires, and the emergence of new tribes changed the political picture. During this time, the Israelites came to the fore, a people who emerged from smaller groups and, according to biblical tradition, had been freed from Egyptian bondage. Jerusalem was soon to become of central importance to them. but at first, the city remained in the hands of the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe. The Bible describes Jerusalem at this time as a fortified city of the Jebusites that was difficult to capture. According to tradition, it was not until King David in the 10th century BC that he succeeded in conquering the city and making it his capital. Whether this happened in exactly this way historically is disputed among historians. What is certain, however, is that during this time, Jerusalem experienced a rise that permanently placed it at the center of history. The early centuries of Jerusalem are thus an epoch of foundations. This is where the first walls were built, where the first religious significance was built, and where the strategic location of the city became apparent. Even then, Jerusalem was more than just a place. It was a symbol, a hub, a destination for kings and conquerors. Its history began small, with peasants and princes, but it already had the potential for greatness and tragedy. When we look back at this early period, we recognize the roots of a city that was never defined solely by external power. As early as the Bronze Age, geography was associated with myth, water with faith, walls with longing in Jerusalem. This is where the history of the City of Cities began, a story that would soon take on a new dimension through kings such as David and Solomon.
Chapter 3: King David and the Conquest of Jerusalem. The figure of King David is one of the most dazzling figures in the Bible and in world history. For Judaism, he became the ideal image of the God-anointed king. For Christianity, the ancestor of Jesus. For Islam, a prophet. With him begins the epoch in which Jerusalem was elevated to the capital of a united kingdom and the spiritual center of an entire people. Even though historians are still arguing about the exact circumstances of his life and work, one thing is undisputed. With David, Jerusalem finally enters the great stage of history. According to biblical tradition, David was initially a simple shepherd from Bethlehem. Early on, he showed courage and determination that made him a hero in the eyes of the people. The most famous episode of his youth is the fight against the Philistine giant Goliath. With a slingshot, he defeated the seemingly invincible opponent, and thus won the respect and recognition of the people of Israel. Soon after, he entered the service of King Saul, the first king of Israel. But the relationship between the two was marked by mistrust and rivalry. Saul saw in David a dangerous competitor, while David increasingly distinguished himself as the leader of the people. After Saul's death in a battle against the Philistines, David first became king over Judah, the southern part of the land. It was not until a few years later that he succeeded in uniting the other tribes of Israel under his rule. But he needed a center, a capital that symbolized this unity. He chose Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was still a Jebusite city, heavily fortified and strategically located. It did not clearly belong to either Judah or Israel and therefore offered itself as a neutral place to connect the two parts of the country. It was also located on a hill surrounded by valleys, with the vital Gihon spring nearby, an ideal location for a capital city. David's conquest of Jerusalem is described in the second book of Samuel. According to the report, his troops managed to enter the city through a secret water channel and conquer it. Whether this episode is historically accurate remains to be seen, but it shows the impression that the capture left behind. It was a surprising, ingenious move that made David an unrestricted ruler. The Jebusites lost their city, and Jerusalem was henceforth referred to as the City of David. With the capture of Jerusalem, a new phase in the history of the city began. David made it the political and religious capital of Israel. He had walls and palaces built and moved the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest relic of the people of Israel, in which the tablets with the 10 Commandments were kept, to Jerusalem. In doing so, he elevated the city not only to the political center, but also to the spiritual center. There was tremendous foresight in this decision. From then on, Jerusalem was inextricably linked to the faith and identity of Israel. The Bible describes how David brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city with a great procession. Dances, music, and sacrifices accompanied this act, which symbolized the fusion of religion and politics. From then on, Jerusalem was considered the place where God himself dwelt in the midst of his people. The idea that heaven and earth touch here became the foundation of the city's later importance. But David's reign was not free of conflict. His reign was marked by battles against external enemies such as the Philistines, Moabites, and Ammonites, but also by internal tensions. The tragic episode surrounding his relationship with Bathsheba and the rebellion of his son Absalom is particularly well known. These stories show that David was not only the ideal king, but also a man full of weaknesses and contradictions. And yet, his reign remained a turning point. He united the tribes of Israel, conquered a capital, and laid the foundation for a dynasty that would shape centuries. In the memory of the people of Israel, David became the embodiment of kingship par excellence. His name became synonymous with strength, justice, and closeness to God. Even after the fall of his empire, the longing for a son of David who would restore the kingdom remained. This hope shaped Judaism into the time of exile and beyond. For Jerusalem itself, David's decision was of immeasurable importance. A Canaanite fortress became a city that was now connected to an entire nation. From here, David ruled over his kingdom. From here, the rise of Jerusalem to the holy city began. Without David, Jerusalem might have remained just one of many small towns in the Judean mountains. With him, however, it became the heart of a people and the stage for a story that continues to have an impact today. This laid the foundation for the next great epic, the reign of his son Solomon, who was to further expand the city and, with the construction of the temple, give it the monument that finally made Jerusalem the religious center of the world. Chapter 4: Solomon's Temple and the Prosperity of the Kingdom of Israel. With the death of David and the accession of his son Solomon to the throne, an era began that was glorified in Israel's memory as the Golden Age. While David had laid the groundwork, the conquest of Jerusalem, the unification of the tribes, the establishment of the city as a political and religious center, it was Solomon who transformed those foundations into a formidable empire. Under his rule, Israel reached a heyday of power, prosperity, and culture, and Jerusalem became the shining center. Solomon is described in the Bible as a wise king who had an extraordinary gift, divine wisdom. The famous story of the Solomonic judgment, in which he resolves the dispute between two women over a child by making a seemingly cruel but wise decision, shows how strongly he was perceived as a symbol of justice and prudence. This wisdom was combined with political skill. Solomon forged alliances with neighboring empires, promoted trade and culture, and made his empire a respected player in the region. But Solomon's greatest legacy was undoubtedly the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. David had the idea, but it was Solomon who put it into practice. On the Temple Mount, which later became the central location of the city, he had a sanctuary built, which was considered God's abode on earth. The temple was not only to be a place of prayer and sacrifice, but also the visible sign that Jerusalem was the holy city of Israel. The construction was a monumental project. According to biblical tradition, craftsmen and materials from many regions were used. Cedar wood from Lebanon, stones from the quarries of Judea, gold and precious stones from distant lands. Thousands of workers were employed for years. The temple was a rectangular building whose innermost, the Holy of Holies, was only allowed to be entered by the high priest once a year. There stood the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred relic of the people, symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. With the temple, Jerusalem finally received the religious significance that was to shape it for thousands of years. Here, it was believed, God himself lived. This is where the people gathered for the great festivals. Here, the political was combined with the religious, the rule of the king with the closeness of God. Solomon's reign brought not only religious, but also economic and cultural flourishing. Trade routes were secured, alliances were formed, riches poured into Jerusalem. The Bible tells of his encounter with the Queen of Sheba, who was impressed by his wisdom and wealth. Whether the story is literally historical or not, it shows how Solomon's fame radiated far beyond Israel's borders. The city of Jerusalem itself grew during this time. Palaces, administrative buildings, and fortifications were built. The population increased, and the city began to take on the form of an urban metropolis that it would maintain in later centuries. For the first time, Jerusalem became not just the capital of a small people, but a center that was perceived and respected in the region. But Solomon's reign also had its dark sides. The biblical sources tell of the burden he placed on his people. High taxes, forced labor, and the favoritism of certain tribes led to tensions. His numerous marriages with foreign princesses, often for political reasons, brought foreign cults to Jerusalem, which met with criticism from the people. In religious tradition, this was later interpreted as a departure from the pure worship of the one God. After Solomon's death, it became apparent that the shining unity of his kingdom was more fragile than it appeared. Soon, the kingdom was divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Jerusalem remained the capital of Judah, but the time of the United Kingdom was over. The kingdom of David and Solomon, so strongly idealized in memory, had been short-lived in reality. Despite this division, the temple remained the undisputed center. Even though the northern kingdom built its own sanctuaries, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was considered unique. It was the symbol of the special relationship between God and his people, and it became a place of longing for generations. Even after its destruction, it was to live on in the prayers of the Jews. Solomon's time thus marks the first great climax of Jerusalem. The city was no longer just a hilltop fortress, but the heart of an empire that shined with religion, culture, and power. In the memory of the peoples, this epoch remained as the Golden Age, an ideal to which they wanted to return again and again in later times. So it was Solomon who gave Jerusalem the character it still bears today, the center of faith, the place where heaven and earth meet. And even though his empire soon collapsed, he laid the foundation for the city's millennia-long importance.
Chapter 5. Destruction by the Babylonians and the Exile. After Solomon's death, the splendor of the United Kingdom soon faded. The burdens of taxes and forced labor had caused discontent, and the empire was divided into two parts: the northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital at Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its center. From that point on, Jerusalem was no longer the capital of a large unified empire, but of a smaller state whose existence was threatened by the powers of the region. The northern kingdom of Israel existed for only a few centuries before it was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC. The inhabitants were deported, and the empire disappeared from the map. Judah survived for the time being, and Jerusalem remained, but the threat from the great powers of the region grew. The Assyrians were the first great power to threaten Jerusalem's independence. King Hezekiah, who reigned in the 8th century BC, was confronted with an invasion by the Assyrians under King Sennacherib. The Bible describes how Hezekiah fortified the city, built walls, and had a famous tunnel built that connected the Gihon Spring to the interior of the city. This Hezekiah tunnel still exists today and shows how serious the threat was. In a besieged city, the water supply was often the key to survival. In fact, Jerusalem was not taken at that time, even though large parts of Judah were destroyed. For the people, this was a sign of divine salvation that strengthened their faith in the special election of the city. But the danger remained. When the Babylonians took the place of the Assyrians in the 7th century, the situation came to a head. Under King Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon became the dominant power in the Middle East. Judah tried to assert itself between the great powers of Egypt and Babylon, but this proved fatal. The kings of Judah wavered between loyalty and rebellion. Again and again, they tried to break away from the Babylonian supremacy, often supported by Egypt. But the power of Babylon was overwhelming. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem for the first time. The city fell, King Jehoiachin was deposed, part of the elite was deported, and Zedekiah was installed as vassal king. But Zedekiah also dared to revolt. This time, Nebuchadnezzar reacted without indulgence. In 587/586 BC, the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem again. The siege lasted many months and led to hunger, epidemics, and unimaginable suffering in the city. Finally, the walls were breached, the city was plundered, and Solomon's temple was destroyed. The destruction of Jerusalem was a traumatic event. The temple, the heart of the people and symbol of God's presence, went up in flames. The inhabitants were killed or abducted in mass. The ruling class of Judah, including priests, craftsmen, and nobles, were deported into exile in Babylon. Only the poorest people were allowed to stay in the country to cultivate the fields. For the Jewish people, this was a shock that had a deep impact on their identity. Until then,
Faith had been closely associated with the temple and the land. Now they had to learn to live without temples, without sacrificial cults, and without their own country. But it was precisely in this crisis that a new form of faith developed. The turn to the Torah, to the scriptures, to prayer. Faith was internalized, independent of the temple, and thus capable of surviving even in foreign lands. The exile in Babylon thus became a decisive turning point in the history of Jerusalem and Judaism. Although the city was destroyed, it remained alive in the hearts and prayers of the people. The longing for return, for the rebuilding of the temple, for the renewal of the covenant with God shaped the entire exilic literature. Many of the great prophetic texts of the Old Testament were written during this time and reflect this hope. For the Babylonians, the conquest of Jerusalem was a political success. For the Jewish people, it was a catastrophe, but also a new beginning. For in exile, the idea arose that the destruction was God's punishment for the infidelity of the people, but that at the same time there was a promise: the return, the restoration, the renewal. Thus, the memory of the destruction became not only a trauma, but also a symbol of hope. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we thought of Zion, it says in Psalm 137. These words express the immeasurable longing that has been inseparable from Jerusalem ever since. The Babylonian rule did not last long. As early as 539 BC, the Persians under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. With them, a new chapter began that was to make it possible to return to Jerusalem. But the memory of the destruction by the Babylonians remained indelible, as a warning, as a trauma, and as the beginning of that long history in which Jerusalem was destroyed again and again rebuilt.
Chapter 6: The Return and the Second Temple. When the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, a new chapter in Jerusalem's history began. In one fell swoop, the situation changed for the Jewish people, who had been living in exile for decades. Cyrus pursued a different policy than the Babylonians. He did not rely on forced resettlements, but on integration and religious tolerance. In a famous edict, he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This decision was of enormous importance for the exile community. It was understood as the fulfillment of divine promises, as the beginning of a new era. The prophet Isaiah even praised Cyrus as the Lord's anointed, a unique title for a Gentile ruler. For the Jewish people, Cyrus was an instrument of God that made possible the beginning of homecoming and renewal. But the return was not a mass event. Only some of the Jews actually returned to Jerusalem. Many remained in Babylon, where a thriving diaspora community developed. Nevertheless, the return of those who moved home was crucial for the future of Jerusalem. They found a destroyed city, walls torn down, houses decaying, the temple in ruins. The reconstruction was arduous, but it became a central task. The construction of the so-called Second Temple began around 520 BC, during the reign of the Persian king Darius. It was not as magnificent as Solomon's first temple, but it fulfilled the same function. It was the sanctuary, the center of faith, the place of sacrifice and covenant with God. The prophet Haggai encouraged the people by promising that the glory of the new temple would surpass that of the old, not in outward splendor, but in spiritual meaning. With the dedication of the temple in 515 BC, a new phase in the life of Jerusalem began. The city became a religious center again, even though politically it was only a small provincial capital in the Persian Empire. The temple gave the people identity and hope. Even though the Jewish community was small, it was determined to preserve and reshape its religion. Two figures were particularly influential during this time: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, a scribe, brought the law, the Torah, back to the center of life. He gathered the people and read publicly from the scriptures, a moment that is considered the birth of Judaism in its later form. Not only the temple and the sacrifices, but also the law, study, and interpretation became the basis of faith. Nehemiah, on the other hand, was a pragmatist. As governor on behalf of the Persian king, he oversaw the reconstruction of Jerusalem's city wall.
Under the most difficult conditions, threatened by neighboring peoples and internal tensions, he organized the work. In just 52 days, the Bible reports, the wall was rebuilt, a symbol of the fact that Jerusalem had once again existed, not only spiritually, but also politically and militarily. The Persian era brought stability, even if Jerusalem did not play a major political role. It was a small town in the shadow of great empires, but it had something that no other city had, a growing religious significance that radiated far beyond its walls. During this time, Judaism was decisively formed. Exile had taught people that faith could also endure far from home. With the return and the building of the temple, both the spiritual and the physical presence were now combined. The temple became the center, but at the same time, the law, the Torah, gained more and more weight. Rabbis and scribes began to shape a new religious culture that continues to have an impact today. For Jerusalem, this epoch meant a reconstruction, but also a reorientation. The city was revived, but it remained small compared to the metropolises of the Persian Empire. Their strength lay not in power or wealth, but in their unique religious identity. When Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East in 332 BC, Persian rule ended and the Hellenistic era began. But the foundations laid in the decades after the return were to remain. Jerusalem was once again the city of the temple, the heart of the Jewish faith, a place where history and religion were inextricably linked. The return from exile and the construction of the Second Temple were more than a historical event. They were a spiritual new beginning. The catastrophe of the Babylonian destruction gave rise to a new form of faith that was to last for thousands of years. And Jerusalem, the city that had fallen so many times before, rose again, a symbol of the unshakable hope that even after destruction and exile, a new beginning is possible.
Chapter 7: Persian and Hellenistic Period. With the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the construction of the Second Temple, the city was once again a religious center in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, but politically it remained insignificant. It was part of the Persian province of Yehud, which was directly subordinate to the Persian satrap in Syria. The Persian rule was comparatively tolerant, and so the Jewish community was able to maintain its religious customs undisturbed. The temple became the center of life again, and the law of the Torah became increasingly important. The Persians knew how to create stability through local self-government. In Jerusalem, the priesthood was allowed to exercise its religious authority as long as the taxes flowed to the king. The city itself remained small, little more than a regional center. But it was precisely during this time that a deeper piety developed that was to shape later Judaism. The experiences of destruction and exile gave rise to a faith that was based more on scripture and prayer than on political power. However, a drastic change occurred when Alexander the Great moved to the Middle East in 332 BC. His victory over the Persian Empire changed the entire region, including Jerusalem. Alexander was welcomed by many Jews as a liberator because he initially did not bring destruction, but new perspectives. With him, the era of Hellenization began, which was to have far-reaching consequences. Alexander's reign was short-lived, but his legacy remained. After his death in 323 BC, his empire fell apart under his generals. Palestine, and thus Jerusalem, were caught between the fronts of the two powerful successor states, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. Over a century, control changed several times between these dynasties. Under the Ptolemies, the situation for Jerusalem was mostly calm. The Egyptian rulers demanded taxes, but intervened little in religious affairs. Judaism was able to continue to develop, even though Greek culture was increasingly influential. Greek language, architecture, and way of life spread. Especially in Alexandria, where a large Jewish community lived, a synthesis of Jewish tradition and Greek education emerged. It was also there that the famous Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was created. In Jerusalem itself, the population remained more firmly anchored in its own tradition, but Hellenization did not stop there either.
Greek names appeared, sports facilities and theaters were built, and the priesthood came into contact with new ways of thinking. For some Jews, this was an enrichment, for others, a threat. The conflict between tradition and adaptation began, which accompanies Judaism to this day. When the Seleucids took over in the 2nd century BC, the situation worsened. Especially under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, there was an aggressive policy of Hellenization. Antiochus not only wanted to promote Greek culture, but also to suppress the Jewish religion. Temple service was restricted, Jewish customs were banned, and an altar to the Greek father of the gods, Zeus, was erected in the temple itself. For the Jews, this was an unparalleled sacrilege. The temple, the holiest place, was desecrated. Many felt that this was the low point of their history, even worse than the destruction by the Babylonians, since this time it was not about external power, but about the core of their faith. The reaction was not long in coming. The resistance against the Seleucids gave rise to the Maccabean revolt, led by the Hasmonean priestly family. In a fierce guerrilla war, they succeeded in pushing back the Seleucids and purifying and reconsecrating the temple in 164 BC. This event is still celebrated today in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, which commemorates the rededication of the temple. The Hellenistic era was therefore ambivalent for Jerusalem. On the one hand, it brought cultural enrichment, contacts with the Greek world, translations, and intellectual impulses. On the other hand, it led to tensions between tradition and assimilation, which eventually escalated into open conflicts. Jerusalem was at the center of these conflicts because it was here that the temple was located, the symbol of faith and identity. At the end of this epoch, the city was once again a religious center, but it had also experienced how dangerous cultural and political foreign rule could be. The tensions between Jewish tradition and Greek influence were to shape the coming centuries, and were the background against which Rome appeared on the stage. In the Persian and Hellenistic periods, Jerusalem was a city without great political power, but with growing spiritual importance. The conflicts that arose here were not only religious in nature, but cultural, the question of how far one could open oneself to the world without losing one's own identity. This question made Jerusalem a focal point long before Rome took control.
Chapter 8. The Maccabees and the Hasmonean Dynasty. The second half of the 2nd century BC marked a time of uprising, the struggle for freedom, and a brief phase of national self-determination for Jerusalem. The focus was on the Maccabean revolt, which resulted not only in the recovery of the temple, but also in the founding of its own dynasty, that of the Hasmoneans. The revolt was triggered by the brutal religious policy of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His attempts to suppress the Jewish religion and impose Greek culture by force had struck Jerusalem to the heart. The temple had been desecrated by the construction of an altar to Zeus, and circumcision and Sabbath celebrations were forbidden. For many Jews, this was a direct attack on their identity and their relationship with God. In this desperate situation, a family from the priestly family of the Hasmoneans arose. The old priest Mattathias from the city of Modin refused to participate in pagan sacrifices and killed a royal official who tried to force him to do so. With this act began the uprising, which his sons, the Maccabees, continued. Led by Judas Maccabees, the resistance developed into a real guerrilla war. The Maccabees took advantage of the topography of the country, ambushed Seleucid troops, and won surprising victories. Their determination and religious zeal made them symbolic figures for the struggle for freedom. The culmination of their success was the reconquest of Jerusalem in 164 BC. The temple, which had been desecrated, was cleansed and rededicated. This event became the origin of the Hanukkah festival, which still commemorates the rededication today. The candlesticks in the temple, according to tradition, burned for 8 days, although there was only oil for 1 day, a miracle that symbolized the divine confirmation of the revolt. But the fight did not end there. The Seleucids tried again and again to regain their rule. The Maccabees had to fight on for decades before they prevailed. Eventually, the descendants of Mattathias managed to gain not only religious but also political autonomy. An uprising movement became a dynasty, the Hasmoneans. Under the rule of the Hasmoneans, Jerusalem developed into a capital that gained political and religious importance. The The Hasmoneans were not only priests but also kings. They combined secular and spiritual power in one person, which had previously been unusual in Israel. The Hasmoneans expanded their dominion considerably. Under John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, their empire expanded over large parts of Palestine, often through conquest and forced conversions. During this time, Jerusalem became the political metropolis of an independent Jewish state that carried weight at the regional level. But the rule of the Hasmoneans was not free of tensions. The combination of kingship and priesthood was controversial, as many Jews believed that only the descendants of Zadok were allowed to exercise the office of high priest. In addition, the expansion led to conflicts with neighboring peoples and the absorption of foreign elements into the empire. In Jerusalem itself, political and religious divisions arose. The Pharisees, a group of scholars and laymen, criticized the rule of the Hasmoneans and demanded stricter observance of the law. The Sadducees, on the other hand, who came mainly from the priesthood, were closer to the ruling elite. These conflicts made Jerusalem a city in which not only external but also internal battles raged. At the same time, the splendor of Jerusalem grew. The temple was expanded, the city walls were strengthened, and the population increased. Pilgrims from all over the country came to the great festivals to offer sacrifices. Jerusalem was once again the undisputed center of Judaism, and its importance radiated far beyond its borders. But the inner turmoil weakened the dynasty. Power struggles within the Hasmonean family led to civil wars, in which rival kings and high priests fought for rule. These conflicts opened the door to a new power that was increasingly interfering in the affairs of the region: Rome. When Pompey, the Roman general, moved to Jerusalem in 63 BC, the independence of the Hasmoneans ended. Pompey besieged the city, invaded the temple, and made Judah a vassal state of Rome. This marked the beginning of a new chapter, in which Jerusalem continued to flourish, but at the same time came under the influence of a world power that would soon determine the fate of the city. The time of the Maccabees and Hasmoneans nevertheless remains unique. It was an era in which Jerusalem not only survived but flourished, in which the Jewish people regained their independence and made the temple the center of life again. At the same time, it was a time of internal tensions which showed that the greatest danger to Jerusalem often came not only from without, but also from within.
Chapter 9: Roman Rule and Herod the Great. When the Roman general Pompey appeared with his legions outside the walls of Jerusalem in 63 BC, a new era began for the city. Rome had become the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, and Jerusalem, which had enjoyed some independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, was now drawn into the maelstrom of Roman politics. The siege ended with a dramatic intervention. Pompey entered the temple, crossed the most sacred threshold, the Holy of Holies, which had previously only been accessible to the high priest. For the Jews, this was a sacrilege, an unimaginable sacrilege. Politically, however, it was the end of their sovereignty. Judah became a vassal state of Rome, depending on the decisions in the distant capital. The following decades were marked by power struggles within the Hasmonean family and the constant intervention of Rome. Various kings and high priests fought for supremacy, and Rome cleverly exploited these rivalries to secure its influence. In this troubled time, a figure appeared on the scene who was to become vital to Jerusalem: Herod, later known as the Great. Herod did not come from the old Hasmonean line, but from an Idumean family. His father, Antipater, had already served as an administrator under the Romans, and Herod himself was a master at allying himself with the powerful lords of Rome. Through political skill and military talent, he secured the support of Mark Antony, and later also of Octavian, the later Augustus. In 40 BC, he was officially installed by Rome as the King of the Jews. This marked the beginning of a rule that was to last almost 4 decades and had a lasting impact on Jerusalem. Herod was a man full of contradictions. On the one hand, he was a brutal ruler who mercilessly eliminated opponents and did not even shy away from members of his own family. On the other hand, he was a brilliant builder whose projects transformed Jerusalem and the entire country. His policy was always aimed at securing the power of Rome and at the same time legitimizing his own rule through monumental works. Herod's largest and best-known project was the expansion of the temple in Jerusalem. The second temple, built after the return from exile, was now modest and simple compared to the sanctuaries of other empires. Herod decided to enlarge and embellish it to make it the most magnificent sanctuary of antiquity. From about 20 BC, the reconstruction began, which lasted for decades. The Temple Mount was expanded, huge retaining walls were erected. Parts of it, such as today's Wailing Wall, have been preserved to this day. The new temple was a masterpiece. Clad in white stone, shining with gold, it towered over the city and was visible from afar. For the Jews, it became the pride of their faith. For Herod, it became a symbol of his power. Pilgrims from all over the world came to see it, and even Roman visitors admired its magnificence. But Herod did not only build the temple. He had Jerusalem equipped with palaces, fortresses, and theaters. He built a massive citadel in the city, which later became known as the Tower of David. Outside Jerusalem, he had the fortress of Masada, the port city of Caesarea Maritima, and numerous other monuments built. His goal was to make Judah a modern, Hellenistic Roman kingdom that at the same time retained its Jewish identity. Despite his buildings, Herod remained unpopular among many Jews. His origins as an Idumean made him suspicious, and his close connection to Rome made him appear to be a puppet. Above all, however, his cruelty, with which he eliminated rivals, aroused fear and hatred. He had members of his own family executed several times, including his wife Mariamne and 2 of his sons. The historian Josephus describes him as paranoid and brutal, driven by the constant suspicion that someone might endanger his rule. Under Herod, Jerusalem was a thriving metropolis on the one hand and a city of tensions on the other. The magnificent temple attracted pilgrims and admiration, but the political intrigues and Roman dominance created unrest. The people wavered between pride in the beauty of their city and bitterness over the foreign rule embodied by Herod. Herod died in 4 BC. His death left behind a shattered empire. The Romans divided it among his sons, and soon Jerusalem again fell into the turmoil of uprisings and Roman control. But Herod's legacy remained visible. The temple, the walls, the buildings shaped the image of the city for centuries. In retrospect, Herod's reign is a turning point. He combined Jewish tradition with Roman power politics, leaving behind a Jerusalem that was more magnificent than ever, but also more torn. A few decades after his death, this tension was to lead to new uprisings, at a time when another figure was working in Jerusalem who was to change the history of the city and the world forever: Jesus of Nazareth. Chapter 10: Jesus in Jerusalem, the religious turn. In the 1st century AD, Jerusalem was a city full of contrasts. The temple shone in unprecedented splendor. The streams of pilgrims from all parts of the empire made the city a religious center, and Herod's buildings bore witness to prosperity. But things were fermenting under the surface. Roman rule, the tax burden, and the tensions between different religious groups created unrest. In the midst of this world, a figure entered the stage who was to shape the fate not only of Jerusalem, but of all humanity: Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus came from Galilee, the north of the country, far from the political and religious elite of Jerusalem. There he began his sermon, attracted followers, and proclaimed a message of repentance, charity, and the imminent kingdom of God. But it became clear early on that his path had to lead him to Jerusalem, for here stood the temple, here resided the high priests, here the fate of the people was decided. The Gospels describe how Jesus came to Jerusalem several times, especially for the great feasts. But the highlight was his last entry, a few days before Passover. He rode into the city on a donkey, accompanied by cheering people who waved palm branches and shouted, "Hosanna!" For many, this was the fulfillment of a prophecy, the entry of the Messianic King who would deliver the people. This moment alone made Jesus a challenge to the existing powers. His sermons in Jerusalem were not only directed at the common people, but also against the religious elite. His symbolic act in the temple is particularly well known. He overturned the tables of the money changers, drove merchants out, and shouted that the temple should be a house of prayer, not a den of robbers. In doing so, he attacked the heart of the religious system. For the high priests, this was a provocation that could not remain without consequences. In Jerusalem, Jesus spoke of a new order, of the kingdom of God, which was not based on power and violence, but on love and justice. Many people felt addressed by it, but it was dangerous for those in power. Rome feared any movement that could stir up the people, and the Jewish leadership saw it as a threat to their authority. The events came to a head at the Last Supper, which Jesus celebrated with his disciples in Jerusalem. There he announced his death, broke the bread, and handed the wine with the words that this was his body and blood, a ritual that later became the core of the Christian faith. Shortly afterwards, he was arrested by the authorities, betrayed by one of his closest disciples. The interrogations led him first before the Sanhedrin, then before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The Jewish leaders accused him of declaring himself the Messiah and king, which in Roman eyes meant high treason. Pilate, according to the Gospels, hesitated but was eventually persuaded by the pressure of the crowd and the leadership. The verdict was crucifixion. Jesus' way of the cross led him out of the city, where he was executed on the hill of Golgotha. Nailed to the cross with nails, he died the agonizing death of a rebel. For his supporters, this seemed to be the end of all hopes. The man they had thought was the Messiah had failed. In Jerusalem, of all places, the city he wanted to renew. But it is precisely here that the religious turn that changed history begins. The disciples reported that Jesus was resurrected on the third day after his death. This experience they had in Jerusalem turned grief into enthusiasm, despair into hope. For them, Jesus had not failed, but had overcome death. From Jerusalem, the proclamation began, which was soon to spread throughout the world. Jerusalem was thus not only the place of Jesus' death, but also the starting point of Christianity. In the decades following his death, the disciples met in the city, proclaimed the resurrection, and laid the foundations for the new movement. The book of Acts tells of Peter's sermons in the temple and of the first Christian congregation in Jerusalem. For the city itself, this development was initially inconspicuous. The temple continued to operate, the pilgrims came, and the Romans ruled. But in the eyes of Christians, Jerusalem was now the place where God had opened a new chapter in history. From here, the message went out that a new covenant had begun, no longer in the temple, but in faith in Christ. Jesus' presence in Jerusalem was brief, but its impact was immeasurable. He presented the city with a choice between preserving its old power and hoping for a new world. His death and resurrection made Jerusalem the center of a religion that would soon shape the Roman Empire and the entire world. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the city's history. Jerusalem was no longer only the center of Judaism, but also the origin of Christianity, a dual role that was soon to lead to conflicts, especially when Rome again brutalized the city after a few decades.
Chapter 11. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The first half of the 1st century AD was a time of growing tension for Jerusalem. The Romans ruled Judah with an iron fist, and the burdens on the population were great. High taxes, the presence of foreign soldiers, the arbitrariness of governors, and the appointment of high priests at the discretion of the Romans fueled discontent. For many Jews, this was an attack on their identity and their religion. Jerusalem, the city of the temple, became a powder keg that eventually exploded. The outbreak of the Jewish War in 66 AD had a variety of causes. Religious zealots, the so-called zealots, rejected any foreign rule and called for armed resistance. Many people who suffered from Roman oppression followed them. The Romans reacted with violence, and soon the whole country was in flames. In Jerusalem, the situation escalated. The rebels conquered the city, expelled the Roman garrison, and declared their independence. The Romans could not tolerate such an affront. Emperor Nero sent Vespasian, an experienced general, to the east with a large army. Step by step, he reconquered the land, until finally only Jerusalem resisted. When Vespasian himself became emperor in 69 AD, he transferred the command to his son Titus, and he marched outside the city with 4 legions in 70 AD. The siege of Jerusalem was one of the most cruel in antiquity. Titus had huge ramparts and siege engines built to enclose the city. Hunger and epidemics spread, and the population suffered unspeakably. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who himself witnessed these events, reports of cannibalism and despair within the walls of the city. But the rebels were determined to fight to the end. Various factions within the city, zealots and other groups, even fought each other, while outside, the Roman legions tightened the siege ring. This inner conflict weakened the resistance considerably. In August 70 AD, the Romans finally broke through the defensive lines and invaded the city. The Temple Mount became the last bulwark. During the fighting, a fire flared up and engulfed the temple. Despite Titus's alleged order to spare the sanctuary, the building went up in flames. Soon after, the temple, the heart of Judaism, symbol of God's presence, was completely destroyed. For the Jews, this was a catastrophe of immeasurable proportions. For the second time in their history, they lost their temple. But this time, it was final. The sacrificial cult that had shaped religious life could no longer be continued. Priests and Levites lost their roles, and Judaism had to redefine itself. The destruction of Jerusalem was not only a religious but also a political catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, many sold into slavery. The city was plundered, large parts burned down. Titus celebrated his victories in Rome. The Triumphal Arch, which still stands on the Roman Forum today, shows the spoils from the temple, the golden candlestick, the Ark of the Covenant, the trumpets. For Rome, it was a triumph. For the Jews, a deep wound. The consequences were far-reaching. Without the temple, the Torah, the law, became the new basis of faith. Rabbis and scholars took over the role that priests had previously held. Judaism changed from a victim-centered religion to a scriptural and prayer-oriented form of faith. This transformation ensured his survival until today. For the Christians, the destruction had a double meaning. On the one hand, it was a tragedy, since they also had their roots in the temple. On the other hand, many Christians saw in this event the fulfillment of the words of Jesus, who had foretold the destruction of the temple. For them, this was a sign that a new time had dawned, in which God was no longer confined to one place, but was present in Christ himself. Jerusalem itself lay in ruins after 70 AD. Although the city remained inhabited, its significance was broken. The temple that had made it a unique center no longer existed. The Romans made their power visible. They set up the camp of the 10th Legion in the city and made it clear that any resistance was futile. The memory of the destruction was deeply rooted in the Jewish consciousness. To this day, on the 9th day of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, the fall of the temple is mourned, both by the Babylonians and by the Romans. This day became a symbol of suffering, exile, and the hope of renewal. The destruction of the Second Temple marked a turning point in the history of Jerusalem. It meant the end of the old religious order, the end of political autonomy, and the beginning of a long epoch of foreign rule. But it was also the starting point for the transformation of Judaism and the rise of Christianity. Jerusalem, the heart of a people, lay in ruins, but its importance remained. On the contrary, it was precisely the catastrophe that made the longing for the city stronger than ever. From then on, Jerusalem lived more in the prayers and hopes of the people than within its walls.
Chapter 12. Byzantine Jerusalem, the City of the Cross. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD and the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, Jerusalem was devastated. Emperor Hadrian turned the city into a Roman colony, which he called Aelia Capitolina, and forbanned Jews to enter. This was intended to sever the connection between the Jewish people and its holy city once and for all. For centuries, Jerusalem remained a place of longing for the Jews, which they could only mourn from afar. But the city's history did not end there. It entered a new phase that made it a center of another religion, Christianity. As early as the 4th century, Christianity had developed from a persecuted minority to a growing movement. Jerusalem played a central role in this development because it was here that the decisive events of Jesus' life had taken place: crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. Christians from all over the world regarded the city as sacred, even if it was politically meaningless. A turning point came with Emperor Constantine the Great. In 313, he issued the Edict of Tolerance of Milan, which granted religious freedom to Christianity. Soon after, his mother, Helena, a passionate Christian, began a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Helena searched for the places associated with the life and death of Jesus. In Jerusalem, she identified the site of Golgotha and the tomb of Christ. Constantine had a magnificent church built there, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was consecrated in 335. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre became the new center of Jerusalem. It was not only a building, but a symbol. Here, the Christians believed the salvation of the world had taken place. Pilgrims from all parts of the empire flocked to the city to see the holy places. Jerusalem, which had lost its importance after the destruction of the temple, once again became the center of a world religion. Under Byzantine rule, the city flourished. New churches were built, monasteries and pilgrims' hostels were built, roads were expanded. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian had the magnificent Nia Church built, the largest church in the city. Jerusalem was transformed into a Christian metropolis whose significance went far beyond its size. The Jewish presence remained severely restricted during this time. Jews were only allowed to enter the city on certain days, such as to weep over the Temple Mount on Tisha B'Av. For them, Jerusalem was a lost paradise, while for Christians it became the city of the cross. This religious shift shaped the next centuries. Pilgrimage reports from this time give us a vivid picture. Believers from Syria, Egypt, Armenia, and even from distant countries such as Gaul or Britain set out on the dangerous journey to the Holy Land. Jerusalem became a place of encounter, where Christians of different traditions met. For them, it was the fulfillment of the biblical promise that the nations would go to Zion. But despite its religious flourishing, Byzantine Jerusalem was not a prosperous city. It lacked strategic and economic importance. It was away from the major trade routes. His wealth was not in Golda power, but in the faith of the pilgrims. At the same time, this dependence made the city vulnerable. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the Byzantine Empire was shaken by internal crises and external threats. Jerusalem was not unaffected. Again and again, there were conflicts between different Christian groups, for example, between followers of different theological directions. Earthquakes and fires also caused great destruction. The greatest shock came in 614, when the Persian Sassanids under King Khosrau II invaded the Holy Land. Jerusalem was conquered, churches looted, thousands of residents killed or abducted. The relic of the Holy Cross, venerated in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was brought to Persia, a shock for the entire Christian world. It was not until 15 years later that Emperor Heraclius was able to reconquer the city and triumphantly return the cross. But this recovery was short-lived. Just a few decades later, new conquerors appeared on the scene, the Arabs, who began an unprecedented expansion under the banner of Islam. In 638, the Byzantine defenders surrendered Jerusalem to Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab without a fight. This marked the end of the Byzantine era, and a new phase began, the Islamic one. The Byzantine period was formative for Jerusalem because it placed the city in the heart of the Christian world. The construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre made it a central pilgrimage destination, and the memory of the life of Jesus gave it a significance that Roman destruction had not been able to erase. But the city was also a place of conflict, destruction, and changing rulers, a pattern that would run through the entire history of Jerusalem.
Chapter 13. The Islamic Conquest and the Dome of the Rock. In 638 AD, the fate of Jerusalem changed again fundamentally. After centuries of Roman-Byzantine rule, in which the city had shone above all as a Christian center, the Muslim Arabs conquered the city under the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. The Byzantine garrison was weakened, and the population had suffered from wars and Persian invasions. In contrast to earlier conquests, the transition was remarkably peaceful. Patriarch Sophronius personally handed over the city to Caliph Umar. This marked the beginning of a new era in which Jerusalem was incorporated into the religious cosmos of Islam. For Muslims, Jerusalem was a holy place from the beginning. Although the religious center of young Islam was in Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem had a special spiritual significance. The Quran itself does not mention the city directly, but Islamic tradition identifies it with the farthest sanctuary, Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which is mentioned in Surah 17. From here, according to the belief, the Prophet Muhammad began his ascension to heaven, Isra and Miraj. This made Jerusalem the third holiest city in Islam. Under the Umayyads, who ruled over the caliphate from Damascus, this importance was made visible. Caliph Abd al-Malik had the Dome of the Rock built from 691 onwards, a monument that still characterizes the cityscape today.
The golden domed building on the Temple Mount is not only an architectural masterpiece, but also a strong religious symbol. The Dome of the Rock was built over the striking rock, which is revered in Judaism as the location of the temple, and in Islam as the starting point of Muhammad's ascension. With its magnificent golden dome and ornate mosaics, Abd al-Malik set an example. Jerusalem was now part of the Islamic world and a center of faith. The building was also an expression of political power. At a time when Mecca was still under the control of rival groups, the Dome of the Rock was intended to underline the spiritual authority of the Umayyads. Shortly afterwards, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was also built, located south of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. It was destroyed and rebuilt several times, but its role remained, a central sanctuary that consolidates the importance of Jerusalem for Muslims to this day. Together with the Dome of the Rock, it formed an ensemble that made the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the heart of the Islamic presence in the city. Islamic rule brought a new order to Jerusalem. Christians and Jews were recognized as owners of the book and were protected, but had to pay special taxes and accept that they did not have the same rights as Muslims. Nevertheless, their presence in the city was allowed, and Jerusalem once again became a place of religious diversity, albeit under Muslim dominance. The city experienced a heyday under the Umayyads. New roads, markets, and buildings were built. Pilgrims from all parts of the empire flocked to Jerusalem. Islamic culture shaped architecture, language, and everyday life. The Temple Mount, which had lain fallow since the destruction of the Second Temple, now became the center of a new religious identity. Under the Abbasids, who replaced the Umayyads in the 8th century, Jerusalem lost political importance as the capital of the caliphate was moved to Baghdad. But the city remained a pilgrimage destination, a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side. During this time, the scholars of Islam developed numerous traditions that emphasized Jerusalem's special position. For the Christians, Jerusalem remained a sanctuary even under Islamic rule. Pilgrims could continue to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, albeit under conditions. Emperor Charlemagne even promoted pilgrimages to the Holy Land and maintained relations with the caliphs. But there were also tensions. In the 11th century, the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, an act that caused outrage in the West and was later interpreted as one of the triggers of the Crusades. The Islamic conquest permanently changed the religious fabric of Jerusalem. The city was no longer exclusively Christian, but part of a new, much larger world. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque made it a center of Islam, connected to Mecca and Medina. At the same time, it remained significant for Christians and Jews, an ambiguity that was to lead to conflicts again and again in the centuries to come. Islamic rule marked the beginning of an era in which Jerusalem was rarely the political center, but increasingly radiant as a religious symbol. The Temple Mount, once the center of Judaism and then orphaned, has now become one of Islam's holiest places. The golden dome of the Rock shone over the city, proclaiming that Jerusalem was part of a new spiritual order. Chapter 14: The Caliphate and Medieval Jerusalem. After the conquest by the Arabs and the construction of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Jerusalem was firmly integrated into the Islamic world. But the centuries of the Middle Ages were marked by changing rulers, religious diversity, and recurring conflicts. While Jerusalem rarely remained a political center during this period, it became more and more a symbol whose significance far exceeded the city's borders. Under the Umayyads in the 7th and early 8th centuries, Jerusalem had been developed into a glittering religious center. With the transition to Abbasid rule from 750 onwards, the situation changed. The capital of the caliphate shifted to Baghdad, and Palestine moved to the political sidelines. Nevertheless, Jerusalem remained a holy place that attracted pilgrims from all parts of the Islamic world. Merchants, scholars, and believers came to see the Dome of the Rock and pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Abbasids ensured that the religious significance of Jerusalem was firmly anchored in Islamic memory. Numerous hadiths, traditions of the Prophet, emphasize the sanctity of the city and its role as the place of judgment. In the Islamic imagination, Jerusalem thus became a place where the history of mankind was to be completed. But Jerusalem was not only a pilgrimage destination in the Middle Ages, but also a place where different religions lived side by side. Christians continued to have access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Jewish communities existed, albeit often in difficult conditions. Everyday life was characterized by a coexistence that was not free of tensions, but usually worked. From the 10th century onwards, Jerusalem became the focus of new powers. The Fatimids, a Shiite dynasty from North Africa, conquered the city in 969. They made Cairo their capital and regarded Jerusalem as an important religious base. During her time, the city was destroyed and rebuilt several times. A particularly dramatic event was the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 by the Caliph al-Hakim. For the Christians of the world at that time, this was a shock. Reports of this sacrilege quickly spread to Europe, reinforcing the idea that the holy sites were in danger, a motive that would later play a role in the Crusades. The Fatimids soon had to fend off the attacks of the Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty that conquered large parts of the Middle East in the 11th century. In 1073, the Seljuks succeeded in taking Jerusalem. But their rule was short-lived and marked by internal conflicts. The city once again became the plaything of changing powers, and the population suffered from sieges, famine, and insecurity. During this time, tensions between the religions also intensified. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem became more unsafe, and reports of attacks on Christian travelers reached Europe. These developments, combined with the story of the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, led to the idea of a military liberation of Jerusalem becoming more attractive in the Christian West. For the Jews, medieval Jerusalem was a city of longing, which they usually only knew from a distance. There were always small communities, but the number of Jews remained small. Their prayers and songs kept the memory alive, and the motif of returning to Zion became an integral part of Jewish identity. Despite the political uncertainty, Jerusalem remained a center of learning and piety. Muslim scholars wrote works about the sanctity of the city. Christian monks recorded accounts of pilgrimages, and Jewish poets sang of the lost glory of Zion. The city was thus not only a real place, but also a symbol that lived in hearts and minds far beyond its walls. When news of the First Crusade reached the Islamic world at the end of the 11th century, Jerusalem was a city that had lost its importance, but whose religious weight was unbroken. For Muslims, it was the third holiest place. For Christians, the scene of crucifixion and resurrection. For Jews, the city of David and Solomon. This confluence of meanings made them the target of a conflict that was to shape the medieval world. The centuries of the Caliphate had shaped Jerusalem, but also made it vulnerable. It was a city that shone less through political power than through religious symbolism. And it was precisely this symbolism that was soon to become the focus of a dispute that was to last more than 2 centuries, the Crusades. Chapter 15: The Crusades and the Battle for the Holy City. At the end of the 11th century, Jerusalem became the focus of a world historical conflict that was to shape the Middle Ages, the Crusades. For Christians, the city was the site of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the highest goal of a pilgrimage. But for centuries it had been under Muslim rule, and reports of the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the endangerment of pilgrims had given the impression in the West that the holy places were in danger. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he combined piety with a promise of forgiveness of sins. Thousands of knights, peasants, and adventurers set off, and Jerusalem became their destination. In 1099, the Crusaders reached the walls of the city after a long and costly journey. The siege lasted several weeks before they succeeded in taking Jerusalem. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. Contemporary reports describe a bloodbath in which tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed. For the Crusaders, it was the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. For the Muslim and Jewish population, it was a catastrophe. With the conquest, the time of the Kingdom of Jerusalem began. The Crusaders established a Latin monarchy with Jerusalem as its capital. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre became its religious center, and numerous monasteries, hospices, and fortresses were built. Orders of knights such as the Templars and the Knights of St. John made the city a military and spiritual base. For many Christians in Europe, the news of the conquest of Jerusalem was a triumph, a sign of divine grace.
But the rule of the Crusaders was precarious from the beginning. They formed a small minority in a country whose population remained predominantly Muslim. Jerusalem itself was transformed into a Christian city. Muslims and Jews were expelled or were only allowed to live under restrictions. The city received a new administration, new churches and fortifications. But the Crusader states were constantly threatened by attack, and their existence depended on supplies and support from Europe. In the 12th century, the Muslim powers began to reorganize. At first, they were divided, but over time, strong leaders emerged to organize resistance against the Crusaders. Particularly noteworthy is Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who knew how to unite Muslims and put Jerusalem at the center of his politics. In 1187, the decisive Battle of Hattin took place, in which Saladin's troops defeated the Crusaders. A few months later, he moved to Jerusalem. Unlike in 1099, he refrained from a bloodbath. The Christian defenders capitulated and the population was spared. Christians were allowed to leave the city or stay for ransom. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained intact. For Muslims, the reconquest of Jerusalem was a triumphant moment that is still alive in Islamic memory today. The news of Saladin's victory caused consternation in Europe. The Third Crusade, under the leadership of Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was to reconquer the city. But despite military successes, the Crusaders did not succeed in retaking Jerusalem. A truce between Richard and Saladin regulated access. Christians were allowed to continue to travel to the city as pilgrims, even if it remained politically under Muslim rule. In the 13th century, there were further attempts to reconquer Jerusalem. The Sixth Crusade under Emperor Frederick II in 1229 brought a surprising solution through negotiations. Jerusalem was peacefully handed over to the Christians. But this rule was unstable and lasted only a few years. In 1244, Muslim troops from Central Asia recaptured the city and destroyed large parts. This essentially ended the Christian presence in Jerusalem. The Crusades left deep marks. For Christians, the short period of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a culmination of religious fulfillment, but also a trauma in the face of the later loss. For Muslims, Saladin's reconquest was a symbol of triumph and justice. For the Jews, the Crusades were a time of suffering, not only because of the massacres in Jerusalem itself, but also because of the pogroms in Europe that triggered Crusade sermons. In the age of the Crusades, Jerusalem was less a normal city than a symbol for which entire armies fought, glorified in sermons and glorified in chronicles. The real everyday life of its inhabitants, who had to endure famines, sieges, and violence, disappeared behind the glamour of religious propaganda. At the end of the Crusades, Jerusalem remained firmly in Muslim hands. But the memory of the Holy City remained alive in the Christian West, and nourished the longing to win it again for centuries. In the Islamic world, on the other hand, the defense of Jerusalem was a testament to the strength of faith and the unity of the Ummah. Thus, the time of the Crusades finally made Jerusalem a city whose importance went far beyond its walls. It was a target of longing, a symbol of faith, but also a place of bloodshed and destruction. And this dual role was to continue to accompany the city in the centuries to come.
Chapter 16: Saladin and the Reconquest. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 is considered one of the most significant turning points in the city's long history. While the conquest by the Crusaders in 1099 had been marked by bloodshed and massacres, Saladin's capture wrote a completely different chapter. It showed how much the city was not only a military target, but above all a symbolic one, the possession of which decided on the victory or defeat of entire cultures. Saladin, born Yusuf ibn Ayyub, came from a Kurdish family and rose to become one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world in the 12th century. At first, he served the Fatimids in Egypt, but soon he founded his own dynasty, the Ayyubids. He united Syria, Egypt, and large parts of Mesopotamia under his rule and made resistance against the Crusaders a central concern. His charisma, piety, and strategic acumen made him a leader who brought together Muslims of all persuasions, Sunnis, Shiites, and Sufis alike. The decisive conflict came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. There, Saladin's army succeeded in luring the Crusader army into a trap and destroying it completely. The loss of the true cross, one of the most important relics of Christians, was a heavy blow to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The way to Jerusalem itself was thus clear. When Saladin marched outside the city in October of the same year, the memory of the massacre of 1099 was still fresh. The Christian defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, knew that a bloody end could threaten. But Balian negotiated with Saladin and asked for an honorable surrender. Saladin agreed. The residents were allowed to leave the city if they paid a ransom. Those who could not afford it were ransomed by generous donations from richer Muslims and Christians. The few who were taken prisoner were far fewer numerous than those who had been slaughtered in the streets of Jerusalem nearly a century earlier. This comparatively mild treatment made a deep impression, not only in the Islamic world but also in Europe. Saladin was described even by his opponents as noble and magnanimous. His behavior contrasted sharply with the cruelty of the Crusaders of 1099 and shaped his image as a knightly opponent that continues to have an effect today. After the capture of Jerusalem, Saladin reorganized the religious landscape of the city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained and was allowed to continue to be used by Christians, but the Temple Mount became an Islamic center again. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque have been cleaned, provided with new Quran inscriptions, and restored to their full glory. Saladin thus sent a strong signal. Jerusalem was now once again a city of Islam that put its holiness in the foreground. For the Muslims, this was a triumph that went far beyond the military level. In sermons and chronicles, the reconquest was celebrated as the fulfillment of God's will. Jerusalem had returned to the community of Islam, and Saladin became the hero of an entire epoch. But the success immediately provoked a reaction. In Europe, news of Jerusalem's loss spread like wildfire. Pope Gregory VIII called for the Third Crusade, and soon some of Christendom's most powerful rulers, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England, were making their way to the Holy Land. The Third Crusade brought military successes, but the Christians did not succeed in reconquering Jerusalem. Instead, Richard and Saladin agreed on a truce in 1192 that allowed Christians to access the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as pilgrims, while the city itself remained in Muslim hands. The significance of Saladin's victory, then, lay not only in the recovery of Jerusalem, but also in the creation of a new order. He showed that Muslims and Christians, despite all the differences, could coexist in the city as long as there were clear rules. Jerusalem once again became a place where different religions were present, albeit under Islamic dominance. Saladin's death in 1193 ended an extraordinary reign, but his legacy remained. The Ayyubids continued his policies, and Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, although it changed rulers again and again in the centuries that followed. The figure of Saladin remained a symbol of justice, chivalry, and the ability to combine religious passion with political wisdom. In European memory, however, Jerusalem remained a lost target. The call for new crusades did not die down, but no one was able to win back the city permanently. For the Christians, it remained a place of longing, for the Muslims, a triumph, for the Jews, a distant dream. Saladin's reconquest thus marks one of the great turning points in the history of Jerusalem. It showed that the city was not just a geographical place, but a symbol that determined the fate of entire peoples and religions. His name is still inextricably linked with the city today, as the one who gave it back to Islam and set standards that even enemies respected. Chapter 17: Ottoman Rule, a New Order. In 1517, Jerusalem entered a new era, that of Ottoman rule. After centuries of changing rulers, in which Ayyubids, Mamluks, and briefly also Crusaders had controlled the city, the Ottomans under Sultan Selim I conquered Palestine and made Jerusalem part of their huge empire. From then on, the city would be under the rule of the Sultans of Istanbul for almost 4 centuries, a period of relative stability that made Jerusalem not a political metropolis, but an orderly, well-managed city. The Ottomans considered Jerusalem to be one of their holiest cities. Mecca and Medina were of the highest importance to Islam, but Jerusalem was also considered the third holiest site. The Temple Mount with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was a symbol of Islamic identity that the sultans cultivated and promoted. At the same time, the city continued to be important for Christians and Jews, and Ottoman politics allowed religions to coexist, albeit under clear hierarchical rules. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, Jerusalem experienced a special boom. Suleiman had the city walls rebuilt, which still characterize the image of the old town today. With their gates, towers, and massive stone blocks, they are one of Jerusalem's most impressive monuments. These walls symbolized not only protection, but also the renewal of the city under Ottoman rule. Suleiman also took care of the water supply, had aqueducts and wells built, and promoted the restoration of religious sites. The Dome of the Rock was restored, the inscriptions were renewed, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque received special attention. For Muslims, visiting Jerusalem became easier during this time, and pilgrimages increased. The Ottoman administration organized the city into religious quarters: the Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Armenian quarters, a division that still exists today. Each community was allowed to regulate its own affairs as long as it recognized the supremacy of the Ottomans and paid its taxes. This millet system allowed for a certain autonomy, even if there were clear hierarchies. Muslims came first, Christians and Jews were second-class wards. For the Jews, the Ottoman period brought a certain stability that they had not known for centuries. After the expulsion from Spain in 1492, many Sephardic Jews found a new home in the Ottoman Empire. Families also settled in Jerusalem, reviving Jewish life in the city. Synagogues sprang up, and the longing for Zion became real in a way, even though the community remained small and suffered from economic difficulties. Christian life in Jerusalem was also alive during this period. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained the center, and various churches, Orthodox, Armenian, Latin, competed for control of the holy sites. The Ottomans maintained these tensions through a system known as the status quo. Each community was allowed to use certain places, and changes were strictly forbidden. This system, which was officially established in 1852, continues to have an effect today and determines how Christians divide the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Under the Ottomans, Jerusalem remained a small city without much economic importance. There were no large markets like in Damascus or Aleppo, and the administration was modest. But the city lived from its sacredness. Pilgrimages from all over the world, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, made Jerusalem an international place where languages, traditions, and customs mixed. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire entered a phase of decline, and Jerusalem also felt the consequences. Corruption, economic problems, and the neglect of infrastructure weighed on the city. At the same time, Europe's interest in the Holy Land increased. Christian powers such as Russia, France, and Great Britain began to exert influence by building monasteries, hospices, and consulates. Missionaries and archaeologists came to the city, and the holy sites increasingly became an international topic of conflict. In the 19th century, Jerusalem changed more than in the centuries before. The population grew, new neighborhoods sprang up outside the walls, and European powers brought money, schools, and hospitals to the city. For Jews, the return movement began during this time, which later became known as Zionism. The first settlements sprang up, and the vision of a national home took shape. Ottoman rule finally ended in the First World War. In 1917, British troops under General Allenby moved into Jerusalem, and the Ottomans gave up the city without a fight. This marked the end of an almost 400-year era that had shaped Jerusalem like no other. The Ottomans had given the city stability, new walls, and an orderly religious life. They had not made Jerusalem a political or economic metropolis, but they had ensured that it continued to flourish as a holy place. Within its walls, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, often in tension, sometimes in harmony, but always in the shadow of the golden dome of the Dome of the Rock.
Chapter 18: The 19th Century and the Rise of European Powers. The 19th century brought profound changes to Jerusalem. For centuries, under Ottoman rule, the city had remained a rather insignificant provincial center, whose splendor lay solely in its religious significance. But with the increasing interest of the European powers and the strengthening of new currents within the three monotheistic religions, Jerusalem experienced a kind of rebirth.
A sleepy city became a scene of international politics, religious rivalry, and incipient national movements. As early as the early 19th century, European powers recognized that the key to the Holy Land was important not only religiously, but also politically. France, Russia, and Great Britain used their position as protectors of certain Christian denominations to gain influence. Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant institutions sprang up, and consulates were opened all over the city. This marked the beginning of a new phase in which Jerusalem was not only overshadowed by Istanbul, but also in Europe's field of vision. A first turning point came in 1831, when the Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali and his son Ibrahim Pasha conquered Palestine and temporarily replaced it from the Ottomans. Egyptian rule brought reforms, but also unrest. Many Europeans took the opportunity to expand their presence. When the Ottomans regained control in 1840, this time with European help, the role of the great powers became even clearer. Jerusalem was no longer a remote provincial city, but an international bone of contention. The religious competition was particularly reflected in the holy places. Orthodox Christians, supported by Russia, fought with Catholics under French protection for supremacy in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. These conflicts were not only symbolic, but also contributed to the escalation of international conflicts, such as the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, which was officially triggered by disputes over the holy places, among other things. At the same time, Protestant interest grew. The British and Germans founded schools, hospitals, and churches. The Anglican Episcopal Church, built in 1841, marked the beginning of a new Protestant presence in Jerusalem. Missionaries saw the city as a center from which they could develop their work throughout the Middle East. The 19th century also became a decisive epoch for Judaism. Although small Jewish communities had already lived in the city before, it was only now that greater immigration began. Jews from Eastern Europe, North Africa, and especially from the Ottoman Empire settled in Jerusalem, attracted by the religious significance of the city. Towards the middle of the century, the first Jewish quarters were established outside the walls, such as Mishkanat Sha'anim. This movement was the beginning of a development that would later culminate in Zionism. Jerusalem itself was visibly changing during this time. For a long time, life had taken place almost exclusively within the city walls, but now new districts were being built outside, financed with European money. Hospices, schools, and hospitals shaped the picture. Armenian, Greek, Russian, and Catholic monasteries were expanded or newly built. The influx of pilgrims increased sharply, facilitated by steamships and railways that accelerated travel. The Ottomans tried to maintain control. Especially under Sultan Abdul Hamid II towards the end of the century, administrative structures were improved, roads and telegraph lines were laid out, and the presence of the state was strengthened. But at the same time, the Sultan used the Islamic symbolic power of Jerusalem to emphasize his role as caliph. The Temple Mount remained the heart of Muslim identity in the city, even though international attention was mostly focused on Christian sites. The increasing European presence had ambivalent consequences. On the one hand, it brought modernization, new infrastructures, and medical facilities. On the other hand, it led to a growing internationalization of the city, which broke up old structures and created new tensions. Jerusalem became a place where global rivalries became visible on a small scale, a microcosm of the great game between the great powers. For the Jews, Jerusalem gained a new political dimension during this time. The first representatives of the later Zionist movement saw in the city not only the religious center, but also a possible starting point for the re-establishment of a national home. This movement was still small, but the growing Jewish presence in Jerusalem laid the foundation for later developments. Jerusalem itself was visibly changing during this time. For a long time, life had taken place almost exclusively within the city walls, but now new districts were being built outside, financed with European money. Hospices, schools, and hospitals shaped the picture. Armenian, Greek, Russian, and Catholic monasteries were expanded or newly built. The influx of pilgrims increased sharply, facilitated by steamships and railways that accelerated travel. The Ottomans tried to maintain control. Especially under Sultan Abdul Hamid II towards the end of the century, administrative structures were improved, roads and telegraph lines were laid out, and the presence of the state was strengthened. But at the same time, the Sultan used the Islamic symbolic power of Jerusalem to emphasize his role as caliph. The Temple Mount remained the heart of Muslim identity in the city, even though international attention was mostly focused on Christian sites. The increasing European presence had ambivalent consequences. On the one hand, it brought modernization, new infrastructures, and medical facilities. On the other hand, it led to a growing internationalization of the city, which broke up old structures and created new tensions. Jerusalem became a place where global rivalries became visible on a small scale, a microcosm of the great game between the great powers. For the Jews, Jerusalem gained a new political dimension during this time. The first representatives of the later Zionist movement saw in the city not only the religious center, but also a possible starting point for the re-establishment of a national home. This movement was still small, but the growing Jewish presence in Jerusalem laid the foundation for later developments. At the end of the 19th century, Jerusalem was a city in upheaval. Its population was more colorful than ever. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived next door to each other, each group supported by external powers. The city walls, which Suleiman the Magnificent had built in the 16th century, could no longer contain the dynamic. Jerusalem began to expand into its surroundings, a symbol that the city was on its way to modernity. At the same time, the tension grew. What was a place of religious fulfillment for pilgrims from Europe and America was often an everyday life full of poverty, conflict, and insecurity for the inhabitants. The Holy City had long since become just a spiritual center, but a geopolitical playing field. Thus, at the end of the 19th century, Jerusalem was at a crossroads, shaped by centuries of Ottoman rule, but increasingly under the influence of Europe and growing Jewish immigration. This mixture turned the city into a powder keg that would explode in the 20th century, in the form of wars, divisions, and an ongoing dispute over its identity.
Chapter 19: Jerusalem in the 20th Century, Conflict and Division. The 20th century brought Jerusalem to the center of a political and religious dispute that continues to this day. While the city had previously been characterized primarily by its spiritual significance, it now became the scene of a national conflict between Jews and Arabs, Zionism and Arab nationalism that shook world politics. The first turning point came in 1917, in the middle of the First World War. After centuries of Ottoman rule, British troops under General Edmund Allenby marched into Jerusalem. The Ottomans withdrew without a fight, and Allenby entered the city on foot, a symbolic act intended to show humility. With the victory of the Allies, the Ottoman era ended, and Palestine came under a British mandate, which was officially confirmed by the League of Nations in 1920. For Jerusalem, this meant a new political order. The British tried to balance the different religious communities and at the same time assert their own interests. But soon, the city became the focal point of the growing conflict between the Jewish and Arab populations. Zionism, which had gained strength in the 19th century, demanded the creation of a Jewish homeland. At the same time, the Arabs of Palestine developed a strong national consciousness and rejected Jewish dominance. In Jerusalem, these tensions repeatedly erupted violently. The year 1929 was particularly dramatic when riots broke out around the Western Wall, the holiest place for the Jews. Arab demonstrations led to pogroms against Jewish communities, while the British administration struggled to control the situation. The Western Wall became a symbol of irreconcilable claims, for the Jews a place of prayer, for Muslims part of the Haram al-Sharif, their sanctuary. The 1930s brought an escalation. With the growing influx of Jewish immigrants, especially after Hitler's seizure of power in Germany, Arab residents felt increasingly threatened. The Arab uprising of 1936 to 1939 shook Palestine and also Jerusalem. British soldiers patrolled the streets and violence became commonplace. After World War II and the Shoah, pressure on the international community to find a solution to the Jewish question increased. In 1947, the UN adopted a partition plan for Palestine, a Jewish state, an Arab state, and Jerusalem as an international zone under UN administration. But this plan failed even before it was implemented. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel, and the first Arab-Israeli war broke out. Jerusalem became the embattled center.
The Jewish quarters of the Old City were taken by Arab troops, while West Jerusalem came under Israeli control. At the end of the war, the city was divided. West Jerusalem belonged to Israel. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, was under Jordanian rule. This division shaped the following 2 decades. West Jerusalem developed into the Israeli capital, even if the international community did not recognize this status. East Jerusalem remained controlled by Jordan, and Jews had no access to the Western Wall or other holy sites. The city, which was sacred to 3 religions, was cut in half, with walls, barbed wire, and watchtowers between them. In 1967, the next major turning point occurred. In the Six-Day War, Israel conquered East Jerusalem and the entire West Bank. Israeli soldiers stormed the Temple Mount, and the image of soldiers at the Western Wall became a symbol of the new age. Israel declared the reunification of the city, annexed East Jerusalem, and made the entire city its eternal and indivisible capital. For the Jewish world, this was a historic triumph. For the Palestinians, a deep loss. Since then, Jerusalem has been a focal point of the Middle East conflict. Israel built new Jewish quarters in East Jerusalem, while the Arab residents were mostly treated as residents, not citizens. The Western Wall became accessible again, but the Temple Mount remained a sensitive issue. Israel left the administration of the Haram al-Sharif in the hands of Muslim authorities in order to avoid an open religious conflict, but tensions remained omnipresent. In the decades that followed, the city developed into a microcosm of conflict. Demonstrations, assassinations, and riots dominated the headlines. At the same time, Jerusalem grew economically and culturally. New neighborhoods were built, universities and museums were built, and the city attracted Jews from all over the world. But the division between Israeli and Palestinian residents remained. Internationally, Jerusalem's status remained controversial. Most states refused to move their embassies to the city because they did not recognize Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem. Jerusalem thus became one of the most controversial capitals in the world. For the 3 religions, the city continued to be a holy place. Jews prayed at the Western Wall, Muslims at the Dome of the Rock and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Christians in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But the proximity of these holy sites in a politically divided and conflict-ridden city made Jerusalem a place of permanent tension. At the end of the 20th century, Jerusalem was more than ever a symbol and a bone of contention. For Israelis, it was the capital of their state. For Palestinians, the longed-for capital of a future state. For Christians, Muslims, and Jews worldwide, the center of their faith. This multiple significance made the city unique, and at the same time, one of the most dangerous trouble spots in modern history.
Chapter 20. Modern Times. Symbol, Dispute, and Hope. The 21st century has not allowed Jerusalem to come to rest. Rather, the city is still the heart of the Middle East conflict, a symbol of religious longing and political rivalry at the same time. No other place in the world combines so many contradictions, hopes, and tensions in such a small space. Since the Israeli conquest of East Jerusalem in 1967, the city has changed fundamentally. Israel declared it the eternal and indivisible capital and built new neighborhoods, roads, and infrastructure to strengthen the connection between West and East Jerusalem. At the same time, the Arab population, which makes up about 1/3 of the population, remained in a difficult position. Many have permanent residence rights, but not full citizenship. This led to a feeling of exclusion that repeatedly erupted into protests and riots. The Temple Mount, revered as a holy place in Judaism and central in Islam as Haram al-Sharif, remained the most sensitive terrain. Israel left the administration of the sites in the hands of the Jordanian Waqf in order to avoid open religious conflicts. But tensions have repeatedly arisen when Jewish groups demand access or when Muslim believers fear restrictions. Any incident, small or large, had the potential to throw the entire region into turmoil. Jerusalem also remained a hot topic internationally. For a long time, almost all states kept their embassies in Tel Aviv in order not to take a position on the question of the city's status. In 2017, however, the U.S. government under President Donald Trump officially declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel and moved its embassy. This step triggered jubilation in Israel but outrage in the Arab world.
He made it clear how much the city has become a global symbol whose status has significance far beyond the borders of Israel and Palestine. For Christians, Jerusalem remains a center of faith, but tensions are also evident here. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is still divided by different denominations, which often argue in detail about who has which rights. Sometimes, small gestures are enough to revive centuries-old conflicts. Nevertheless, millions of pilgrims flock to the city every year to pray at the places where Jesus lived and died. For Jews in the modern age, Jerusalem has a double meaning. It is not only the capital of the state of Israel, but also the center of a millennia-old longing. The dream of next year in Jerusalem became reality. But the fulfillment of this dream also brings responsibility. The city is now a political reality that must be managed, protected, and shaped, and not just a symbol in prayers. For Muslims, Jerusalem remains the third holiest place. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are not only spiritual sanctuaries, but also symbols of Palestinian identity. Any intervention by Israel in these sites is perceived as an attack on the entire Islamic world. This makes Jerusalem not only a local, but a global focal point that moves millions of Muslims. The city itself has developed enormously in recent decades. Today, it is a metropolis with over 900,000 inhabitants, modern neighborhoods, universities, high-tech centers, and a diverse cultural scene. But the contrast between the wealthy Jewish quarters and the often neglected Arab neighborhoods is unmistakable. Poverty, unemployment, and political marginalization characterize the lives of many Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Peace processes have repeatedly tried to find a solution to the status of the city. In the 1990s, it seemed possible under the Oslo Accords that Jerusalem could be divided or administered internationally. But the talks failed, not least because of the unbridgeable importance that both sides attach to the city. For Israel, Jerusalem is indivisible. For the Palestinians, indispensable as the capital of a future state. Despite all the tensions, Jerusalem also remains a place of hope. Interreligious initiatives try to build bridges between the communities. Small groups of Jews, Christians, and Muslims work together for peace, often away from the big headlines. Their work shows that despite centuries of conflict, living together is possible if the will is there. The history of Jerusalem in the 21st century is thus a continuation of its old pattern. A city that never belongs only to itself, but is always a symbol of greater things. It is a sacred place and political battlefield, a pilgrimage destination and a modern metropolis, a dream and a reality full of contradictions. In the end, Jerusalem remains what it has been for thousands of years, the city of peace, whose name paradoxically contrasts with its often bloody history. Perhaps its special significance lies precisely in the fact that it has always been more than a geographic place, a mirror of humanity's longing for the divine, for justice, and for peace.